Welcome to The Debate. Today we are wrestling with really one of the most immediate and complex geoeconomic challenges facing Western economies. China's sophisticated dominance in critical raw materials, or CRMs. Beijing is, well, it's using metals like gallium, germanium, and perhaps most crucially, rare earths as a strategic weapon. They seem to be running a complex two-front offense, flooding global markets with below-market price goods, while at the same time curtailing exports of essential inputs needed for really everything from consumer electronics to advanced defense systems. So, the central strategic question arising from this offensive is critical. What is the most effective and sustainable long-term strategy for Western nations, the US and the EU, to counter this dominance? Should we prioritize aggressive domestic supply chain development, what people often call onshoring, or should we strategically focus on achieving global scale and diversification through allied partnerships, which we often refer to as friendshoring?
Right.
Now, my stance is that friendshoring and coordinated international partnerships are absolutely essential. Relying solely on domestic capacity is, I think, simply unfeasible due to fundamental geological limits, steep costs, and, critically, unacceptable time constraints. We just have to leverage our allies to meet the demand curve.
And I take the opposing view. I appreciate that framing of the two-front offensive, but I would argue that aggressive onshoring, particularly for the crucial midstream processing capacity, is really the necessary path to true national and economic security. Only by completely insulating our core industries, especially defense, from any foreign leverage, whether it's allied or otherwise, can we genuinely counter Beijing's manipulation. In this strategic competition, security must fundamentally outweigh cost and convenience.
Okay, let's start maybe by establishing the feasibility challenge because, well, we can't secure what we can't produce quickly enough. The primary hurdle is securing scalable, cost-competitive supply at speed. I see why you prioritize maximum security. I do. But let me offer this perspective. The physical and regulatory limits on U.S. resource extraction make domestic-only solutions seem impossible in the necessary time frame. That 29-year average lead time for a new mine to come online in the U.S. is a staggering data point. It just means rapid domestic scale-up is simply incompatible with the immediate threats posed by Chinese export controls today.
That 29-year statistic, well, it certainly reflects historical challenges in Western mining regulation, no doubt. But it reflects, I think, bureaucratic inertia, not necessarily the reality of the sort of wartime-level industrial mobilization we are discussing here. We have mechanisms like the Defense Production Act, the DPA, that can potentially cut that timeline drastically, especially for processing facilities, which, as I think we'll agree, are the true bottleneck. So I'm not convinced that security can be compromised just to hit an ambitious timeline based on, historical averages. The core objective has to be eliminating the strategic vulnerability inherent in relying on any foreign supply chain.
But the reality remains that even under the most optimistic scenarios, U.S. project pipelines are projected to only meet 2035 domestic demand for maybe 2 of 7 key minerals. We would still require substantial imports of copper, lithium, and graphite. It seems unavoidable. Therefore, the successful strategy must leverage stable, high-volume, lower-cost producers like Australia, which holds almost half of global lithium output, and Canada. We have to support them using U.S. strategic capital, specifically the financing provided by the Development Finance Corporation, DFC, and maybe the Export-Import Bank, EXIM, to rapidly build viable, non-Chinese alternative supply chains.
I'm not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning because China's geoeconomic weapons extend far beyond their physical borders. Their actions demonstrate a clear willingness to use these materials against our defense industrial base. We know that European and U.S. defense industries have already faced, categorical denial of export licenses for essential items like permanent magnets needed for the F-35 fighter jet. That's a real thing. Even worse, China has now extended its restrictions to use what basically amounts to a foreign direct product rule, an FDPR-like mechanism, regulating foreign-made products that contain as little as 0.1% Chinese rare earth material.
0.1%?
0.1. This means that Allied reliance is still potentially subject to Beijing's jurisdiction and discretion. So the security risk, I believe, dramatically outweighs the potential cost premium, which is why the focus must be on guaranteeing domestic processing and production, even if it costs more initially, using targeted mechanisms, insulating us completely.
Okay, but we absolutely must grapple with the economic reality underpinning China's power here. Sustainable cost competitiveness. If we ignore cost, we risk destroying the very downstream industrial base we are trying to protect. U.S. copper production costs, for instance, are already, 8% higher than the global average? Requiring manufacturers to use high-cost domestic materials will inevitably raise their overall production costs relative to global peers. And if we rely on blunt instruments like broad tariffs, such as the planned 50% tariff on semi-finished copper products, we simply transfer that cost directly to U.S. downstream users, potentially hollowing out the very industrial capacity we are trying to reindustrialize. That seems counterproductive.
I appreciate the concern about hollowing out industry, I really do. But that risk has to be weighed against China's active manipulation of prices and key metals. It's designed precisely to deter investment in any viable alternative. They are, frankly, predatory. If we invest only internationally, we remain vulnerable to Chinese economic coercion through price wars, which have already driven down conversion fees and caused a serious crisis in Western smelting capacity. Furthermore, focusing solely on extraction capacity in potentially high-risk foreign jurisdictions without guaranteeing processing capacity nearby is insufficient, regardless of whether it's an ally or not.
That's a crucial point, the processing choke point. But let me illustrate the international risk inherent in your sort of domestic-only approach. Even when the U.S. invests in global infrastructure projects designed to help allies, that infrastructure can still inadvertently funnel materials back to our competitors. Take the Lobito Atlantic Railway project, for example. A great project, but while it increases accessibility to DRC cobalt, that mine material could still flow to Chinese manufacturers unless ex-China processing capacity is prioritized alongside the infrastructure development. So a domestic-only strategy neglects the global architecture that allows Beijing to maintain its leverage. This, for me, confirms the need for strategic international value chain investment that integrates both extraction and refining outside of China.
Immediate defense crisis. We know that under China's new restrictions, companies with any affiliation to foreign militaries will be largely denied rare earth export licenses starting in December 2025. This isn't some long-term economic model exercise. This is an imminent operational denial necessitating sovereign capacity now. Relying on an ally who may face similar geopolitical pressure from Beijing just introduces another potential vector of failure. The U.S. defense industrial base, which relies on, approximately 450 kilograms of heavy rare earths for platforms like the F-35, it simply cannot wait for a global supply chain to maybe stabilize someday.
Okay, I think that brings us to perhaps the most critical point of convergence and disagreement, the location of the true leverage.
Precisely. Where is the real leverage point? Where does China hold the operational choke point that needs immediate remedy?
I agree we need precision here. The real choke point is refining and processing, not simply mining. This is the structural failure point we must address immediately. China controls up to, 90% of the world's processing capacity for many CRMs. This includes staggering figures like 99% for refined spheroid graphite and 93% for magnet manufacturing. We can mine all the ore we want domestically or internationally, but if that raw ore still has to go to China for refinement, well, we have solved nothing, have we? Therefore, friendshoring efforts must focus specifically on co-investing in allied processing facilities.
And how rapidly can that possibly scale? That's the question.
Well, we must support allies like Australia, where nearly 90% of its mined lithium is still refined in China today, to rapidly build local refining capacity. This has to be supported by U.S. investment and, potentially, defense funding, establishing a secure mine-to-magnet allied corridor. This is how we rapidly de-risk the supply chain without having to wait 3 decades for domestic mines to maybe open up, or, years for the regulatory environment to catch up.
I come at the processing question from perhaps a different angle. Building that industrial skill, processing, smelting, and refining, requires enormous capital and reliable domestic scale, and the U.S. sector currently lacks sufficient capacity. You mentioned the crisis in Western smelting yourself. Unless the U.S. uses robust, comprehensive industrial policy, leveraging things like the Defense Production Act or BIL funds, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law funds, to ensure the sustained economic viability of domestic smelting and refining, it will always be reliant on foreign partners for this critical midstream step, regardless of where the ore originates. The need is not just external partnership for processing, but a comprehensive domestic industrial strategy to achieve the necessary processing economies of scale right here, ones that can withstand Chinese economic coercion.
So our disagreement seems to pivot now to how best to catalyze that investment and achieve scale. Is it domestically, relying solely on perhaps high-cost insulation, or internationally, leveraging the existing assets and potentially lower costs of our allies? We need a market signal strong enough to justify these billions of dollars in new processing plants, wherever they are.
For the U.S., I believe the most potent and efficient policy tool is the contract for difference or price floor model, like the one demonstrated by the Department of Defense's deal with MP Materials. This avoids the kind of blanket tariffs that can harm downstream users. Instead, it guarantees a strike price, say $110 per kilogram for NdPr, for a defined period. This provides the necessary price certainty to unlock billions in domestic private investment in high-cost U.S. projects that might otherwise just be deterred by Chinese market manipulation aimed at keeping prices artificially low. It's surgical, it's targeted, and it could be immediately effective for national security materials.
That's a compelling argument for mitigating domestic risk, absolutely. But have you considered that this exact price certainty model probably needs to be extended internationally to have adequate scale now? Domestic projects, even with price certainty, simply cannot meet the projected demand curves in the near term. The G7 Critical Minerals Action Plan provides, I suppose, the conceptual framework, but success requires leveraging our strategic financing tools, like the DFC and EXIM, to support global projects. Think about graphite development in the African Graphite Triangle nations, Madagascar, Mozambique, Tanzania. These projects must agree to sell to U.S. purchasers under similar long-term contract models. We need global scale.
I see why you think that's the necessary path for maximizing supply volume. But securing genuine large-scale leverage against China requires prioritizing insulated domestic capacity first and foremost. We cannot wait for a global system, subject to the geopolitical pressures of every emerging market, to somehow mature and absorb this policy framework before we secure our own defense sector. Building domestic resilience means securing the processing capacity inside our borders, where we control the regulatory environment, and most importantly, where we are not subject to the political pressures placed upon a foreign government, however friendly they may be.
But we certainly agree on the urgency and the necessity of addressing the processing bottleneck. But fundamentally, the U.S. cannot afford to ignore the structural deficits in its domestic supply. The time needed and the costs involved in building everything from scratch are immense. A sustainable long-term strategy, in my view, must balance necessary onshoring efforts with a coordinated friendshoring approach, focusing U.S. strategic capital on developing processing capacity in stable, high-volume allied countries, like Australia and Brazil, to build parallel, non-Chinese supply chains at speed and scale.
And I maintain that true security, especially for the defense industrial base, demands insulated domestic capacity that is not subject to geopolitical negotiation or, frankly, the whims of foreign partners. The U.S. must use targeted industrial policy, such as guaranteed price contracts and perhaps even equity stakes, to catalyze domestic processing and mining, mitigating the price uncertainty caused by Chinese coercion and guaranteeing material flow into the products that secure the nation.
It seems clear the challenge of securing critical raw materials necessitates an integrated strategy, and acknowledging that complexity often requires multiple perspectives and probably multiple policy tools to fully appreciate the difficult path forward.